You wake up one morning, you get in your car, you drive to the gas station, same one you've been going to for years, and the price on the sign stops you. Cold dot, not because it went up 20 cents, because it went up $1.40. Overnight dot, you pull out your phone, thinking it's a glitch, a mistake, some regional anomaly that'll sort itself out by Tuesday, but then you see the news. Markets are rattled. Futures contracts on crude are surging. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is being quietly tapped, and somewhere in a room you'll never have access to in Riyadh or Beijing or Geneva, a decision has already been made that will ripple through every grocery store, every airline ticket, every heating bill, and every mortgage payment in the United States of America. Here's the question no one is asking out loud. What if this has already started? Not the spike, not the headline. The process, the slow, structural unwinding of the assumptions that have kept American energy cheap, accessible, and most critically controllable for the better part of 3 decades. Because here's what history teaches us, and what Wall Street refuses to say plainly: oil shocks don't announce themselves. They arrive, and every single time they have, in 1973, in 1979, in 1990. In 2008, the economists who should have seen it coming were, at that exact moment, explaining why it couldn't happen today. We're going to trace exactly how those shocks unfolded. We're going to follow the money, the politics, and the physics of global crude markets, from the deserts of Arabia to the trading floors of New York, and we're going to build a case, piece by piece, for why the next one isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And based on what's happening right now, it may already be here. By the end of this video, you are going to understand oil markets better than most people who work in them. After World War II, the United States entered what economists would later call the Great Acceleration, a period of economic expansion so extraordinary that future generations would struggle to believe it was real. Between 1945 and 1973, American GDP roughly tripled. Suburban homeownership exploded. The interstate highway system was constructed 47,000 miles of road, the largest public works project in human history at the time. The automobile became not just a convenience but a cultural identity. And all of it, every inch of highway, every subdivision, every factory, every flight, every plastic bottle and polyester shirt and synthetic fertilizer feeding a continent ran on oil, cheap, abundant domestic oil. In the early post-war years, the United States was the world's largest oil producer. Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana were pumping more crude than the rest of the world combined. The Texas Railroad Commission, not the Federal Reserve, not the Pentagon, was the entity that effectively set the global price of oil. By regulating output from American wells, think about that for a second, a state regulatory body in Austin. Texas had more influence over the global economy than most national governments. America was, in every meaningful sense of the word, the Saudi Arabia of the 20th century. But here's the twist. The thing that made America powerful was also the thing that made it fragile. Because when you build an entire civilization, its geography, its industry, its food system, its social contract on the assumption of cheap fuel, you don't just create an economy, you create a dependency. And dependencies in geopolitics. Our vulnerabilities. Enter a man named M. King Hubbert in 1956. Hubbert, a geophysicist, working for Shell Oil, stood before a room of industry professionals and delivered a prediction so alarming that his own employer tried to suppress it. He argued that American oil production would peak sometime around 1970 and then decline permanently because the oil would run out overnight. But because of the mathematics of extraction, you always get the easiest oil first, and as reservoirs deplete, output inevitably curves downward. The room laughed. 16 years later, in 1970, American oil production peaked at exactly 9.6 million barrels per day, almost precisely when Hubbert said it would, and it began to fall. The United States, the country that had built its entire post-war identity on energy dominance, was now quietly becoming an importer. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Nobody wanted to deal with what it meant. That silence, that institutional refusal to confront an uncomfortable structural reality, is the first domino. 7,000 miles away, the Arab world, which sat atop the largest proven reserves on the planet, had watched for decades as Western oil companies extracted their resources at prices those companies set, through contracts negotiated with weak, corrupt, or pliable governments, with profits flowing overwhelmingly to shareholders in New York and London. In 1960, 5 nations, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Their stated goal: reclaim control over their own resources. For the first decade, OPEC was largely toothless. Western oil majors still dominated production, still set prices, still structured the market. But 3 things changed that. First, American production peaked and began declining, which meant the United States could no longer buffer global supply shocks with its own output. The spare capacity cushion, the safety valve, was gone. Second, the 1967 Arab-Israeli War had inflamed political tensions throughout the region and made oil a deeply political instrument. Arab leaders began talking openly about using oil as leverage. Third, and most importantly, in 1971, Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Now, why does that matter for oil? Because oil was priced in dollars. And when the dollar was backed by gold, Arab oil producers were effectively being paid in something with stable universal value. When Nixon severed that link, the purchasing power of their oil revenues became subject to American monetary policy. Every time Washington inflated the dollar, Saudi Arabia effectively took a pay cut. The Arab oil states were furious. The trap was set. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel in what became known as the Yom Kippur War. The United States, under Nixon, authorized a massive airlift of military supplies to Israel. OPEC responded with a weapon it had never fully deployed before an embargo on October 17, 1973. Arab members of OPEC announced they would cut oil production by 5% per month until Israel withdrew from occupied territories, and they would stop exporting to the United States and other countries that supported Israel. Entirely. The price of oil quadrupled in 3 months. From $3 a barrel to $12. And the most powerful economy on earth, the one that had spent 30 years telling itself it was invincible, discovered in the span of a single winter exactly how fragile it was. Within weeks of the embargo announcement, gas stations across the United States began running out of fuel. Lines formed. In some cities, they stretched 4 blocks, cars idling for 3, for 5 hours, waiting for a few gallons. Odd-even rationing was implemented. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days. The national speed limit was dropped to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. Christmas lights were banned in many cities to save electricity. Thermostat settings were made a matter of patriotic duty. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 45% from its 1973 peak to its 1974 trough, one of the worst. Stock market collapses in the post-war era. Interest rates climbed. Growth collapsed. Economists had a word for it that they had never needed before: stagflation, simultaneous inflation, and stagnation. The textbooks said it was impossible. The data said otherwise. Airlines cut routes. Trucking companies raised prices. Farmers who depended on fuel to run equipment and on natural gas to produce fertilizer watched their input costs explode. Food prices spiked. The entire cascade, from the first barrel of withheld crude to the grocery bill of a family in Ohio, took less than 6 months. And here's the thing that history textbooks almost always omit: the embargo itself. Ended in March 1974, the oil started flowing again. Prices didn't come back down. Once OPEC discovered that they could dramatically increase revenues by restricting supply and that the industrial world had no viable short-term alternative to oil, the cartel had fundamentally restructured global power. The era of cheap oil was over, and it would never fully return. Conservation programs were launched. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created in 1975, a network of underground salt caverns in Louisiana and Texas where the government stored emergency oil supplies. Fuel efficiency standards were introduced for automobiles, and for a few years it seemed to work. But the structural dependency, the fact that American infrastructure, Urban planning, industrial processes, and supply chains had been physically built for cheap oil. Couldn't be legislated away. You can't retrofit a suburb overnight. You can't change the range of a gasoline-powered trucking fleet with a Senate resolution. America was still running on oil, just slightly more efficient oil use. Then, in 1979, the second shock hit. The Iranian Revolution overthrew Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a key American ally and one of OPEC's largest producers, replacing his government with Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. Iranian oil production collapsed virtually overnight, and then, barely had the world adjusted, Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, taking both countries' output offline simultaneously. The price of oil more than doubled again, from $15 a barrel to over $35. Gas lines returned. Inflation spiked. Jimmy Carter went on national television wearing a cardigan sweater, asking Americans to turn down their thermostats, declaring the energy crisis the moral equivalent of war. The phrase became a punchline. Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan in a landslide. Reagan's approach was different. He removed price controls on domestic oil production, which helped bring new supply online. He also benefited from a peculiar piece of luck: Saudi Arabia. Angry at OPEC members who were cheating on their production quotas and undercutting Saudi market share, flooded the market with oil in 1986, crashing the price from $30 a barrel to under $10. Suddenly, oil was cheap again, and America exhaled, and then America did the most American thing possible. It forgot SUV. Sales exploded in the 1990s. Fuel efficiency standards were relaxed. Urban sprawl expanded. The distance between where Americans lived and where they worked, measured in miles and minutes, and therefore fuel, grew wider every year. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve sat largely untouched. The Department of Energy's serious funding for alternative energy research was gutted. Wind, solar, and nuclear, which had received emergency funding during the Carter years, were defunded or deregulated into irrelevance. America had solved the oil shock the way an addict solves withdrawal. By finding more of the drug, the global oil market today operates through a system so intricately interconnected that even the people who run it can't fully model its failure. Modes. Here's the basic architecture. Oil is priced globally through two benchmark contracts: West Texas Intermediate, traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange, and Brent Crude, traded in London. These prices are set by a continuous 24-hour futures market where traders, most of whom will never see a single physical barrel of oil, bet on where prices will be weeks, months, or years from now. This futures market is enormously useful. It allows airlines to lock in fuel costs. It allows refiners to plan their purchases. It allows oil companies to hedge their production. But it also means that the price of oil is not set by supply and demand alone. It's set by expectations of supply and demand, which means it's set by fear, speculation, and narrative. When a trader in London thinks there's a 30% chance of a conflict disrupting Saudi pipelines, that belief shows up in the price of oil in Texas today, even if not a single barrel has been disrupted yet. This is crucial. It means oil shocks can begin financially before they begin physically. Now, on top of this, the structural balance of global oil has fundamentally shifted in three key ways since the 1970s. Shift 1. The shale revolution. Between 2008 and 2019, the United States underwent a stunning transformation: hydraulic fracturing. Fracking unlocked vast deposits of tight oil in formations like the Permian Basin in Texas and the Bakken in North Dakota. By 2019, the United States had become the world's largest oil producer, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia. American production hit 13 million barrels per day. This looked like the ultimate answer to energy vulnerability, energy independence. Finally, after 5 decades of trying, but here's what the headlines didn't say: shale oil is expensive to produce, fast to decline, and almost entirely dependent on cheap debt. The average shale well loses 60 to 70% of its production in the first year. To maintain output, producers have to constantly drill new wells. This requires constant capital investment, and for most of the shale boom, That capital came from investors who were willing to fund unprofitable drilling operations on the belief that scale and efficiency would eventually produce returns. Many of those companies never turned a profit. Hundreds went bankrupt between 2015 and 2020. When oil prices crashed, the shale miracle was, in significant part, a product of zero-interest rate monetary policy that made risky debt cheap. And that era is over. Shift 2. OPEC+ and the Russia factor in 2016. OPEC did something it had never done before. It invited Russia to join its production coordination agreements. The resulting group, known as OPEC+, now controls approximately 40% of global oil production. Russia and Saudi Arabia, too, countries with profoundly different economic structures and geopolitical interests, are now the two co-chairs of the organization that most directly influences the global price of energy. The relationship is complex, tense, and frequently unstable. In 2020, it collapsed entirely for several weeks, triggering a price war that sent crude briefly into negative territory. An event so strange that traders had to check their systems to make sure the numbers were real. But it recovered. And OPEC+ has since demonstrated a willingness and ability to enforce aggressive production cuts that directly elevate oil prices, regardless of what consuming nations want. Shift 3. The energy transition paradox. Here is perhaps the most counterintuitive dynamic in global energy today. The world is genuinely transitioning toward renewable energy. Solar and wind costs have fallen dramatically. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating. Multiple major economies have committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. This transition should reduce demand for oil over time, but in the near term, the next 5 to 10 years, it is creating a supply crisis, because the anticipation of declining long-term demand has caused major oil companies, pension funds, and banks to slash investment in new oil exploration and development. Why spend billions developing an oil field that will produce oil in 2030, when you're not sure how much demand will exist by then? Global upstream oil investment has fallen sharply from its 2014 peak. The International Energy Agency has flagged this repeatedly as a serious supply risk. The paradox is this: the green transition may be causing an oil crisis before it provides an alternative. We are in the gap, the bridge between the old energy system and the new one, and that gap is where oil shocks live. The single most important number in global oil markets is spare capacity, the amount of additional oil that OPEC producers could pump immediately if they chose to. This is the world's buffer against supply disruptions. In early 2024, global spare capacity was estimated at roughly 3 to 4 million barrels per day, almost entirely concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This sounds like a lot. Global demand is approximately 102 million barrels per day. 3 million barrels of spare capacity represents less than 3% of daily consumption. In 1985, spare capacity was over 10%. If anything, disrupts supply by more than 3%. A major hurricane? A regional conflict? A pipeline failure? A coordinated OPEC cut? There is no buffer. Parallel to geopolitical fragility at choke points. Approximately 20% of global oil supply transits through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Another critical choke point is the Bab el-Mandeb, strait between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. Both of these choke points have been under active pressure. Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, attacks that began in late 2023 and continued through 2024, have already rerouted dozens of tankers around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and significant cost to energy shipments. The Strait of Hormuz remains the most consequential vulnerability in the global energy system. Iran has, on multiple occasions, threatened to close it. Parallel 3. The debt-fueled domestic production story. Remember what we said about shale. It requires constant reinvestment and cheap debt. Since the Federal Reserve began its rate hiking cycle in 2022, the cost of capital for shale producers has risen substantially. Meanwhile, the easiest, most productive shale formations are being drilled out. The Permian Basin, which drove most of the American shale, growth story is showing signs of productivity decline in its Tier 1 drilling locations. Producers are increasingly drilling Tier 2 and Tier 3 acreage with lower output per well. American production has remained elevated, partly due to productivity improvements, but the rate of growth has slowed markedly, and the financial stress on smaller, independent producers. The backbone of the shale industry is visible in their balance sheets, parallel for dollar dynamics and the petrodollar under pressure. In 1974, in the aftermath of the first oil shock, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck a deal that would shape global finance for the next 50 years. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would guarantee Saudi security and purchase Saudi oil. The system meant that every country in the world that needed to import oil had to hold US dollars to buy it, creating structural, permanent global demand for American currency. This allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits and issue debt at favorable rates, effectively exporting inflation to the rest of the world in exchange for real goods and energy. Today, that system is under visible strain. China and Saudi Arabia have begun settling some oil transactions in Chinese yuan. Russia has been pricing some oil sales in rubles and other non-dollar currencies. India has been purchasing discounted Russian oil in various currencies. This is not yet the end of the but it is a crack. And the historical pattern once cracks appear in monetary arrangements that underpin energy systems, they tend to widen faster than anyone expects. Parallel 5. Consumer debt and the shock absorption problem. The average American household had relatively low debt. Savings rates were higher. The financial system had less leverage. Today, American household debt is at record levels. Credit card delinquencies are rising. The personal savings rate has fallen sharply from its pandemic-era highs. This matters because an oil shock doesn't just hit at the gas pump. It transmits through the entire price system: food, transportation, manufacturing, heating, and it hits hardest on households who are already financially stretched. The shock absorption capacity of American consumers is structurally weaker today than it was in any previous oil shock era. Put all 5 of these together: declining spare capacity, geopolitical choke point pressure, slowing domestic production growth, petrodollar erosion, and high consumer debt, and you have a system that is not just exposed to an oil shock. You have a system that is configured for one every time an oil shock has hit. Policymakers have responded, and every time, the responses have followed a predictable pattern: emergency measures that address the symptom, while leaving the underlying structure intact. Let's take them in order. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Created after the 1973 shock, the SPR reached its maximum capacity of 727 million barrels in 2009. In 2022, in response to rising fuel prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration released approximately 180 million barrels from the SPR, the largest drawdown in its history. By early 2024, the SPR stood at roughly 350 million barrels, its lowest level since 1983. The reserve that was designed to buffer America through an oil shock is now at half capacity. At precisely the moment when geopolitical risks are elevated and spare production capacity is thin. To refill it, the Department of Energy has been buying back oil, but slowly, and at higher prices than it sold. Fuel efficiency standards. Yes, American cars are more efficient than they were in 1973, but Americans also drive more, in bigger vehicles, over longer distances. Total vehicle miles traveled has more than tripled since 1973. Efficiency gains have been partially offset, and in some sectors, more than offset by scale. The electric vehicle promise: EVs are real, they're growing, and they represent a genuine long-term alternative. But the U.S. EV fleet represents approximately 1% of total registered vehicles. The internal combustion engine is not going anywhere in the near term, and the grid that would charge a fully electrified vehicle fleet runs, in significant part, on natural gas, which is itself subject to price volatility and supply disruptions. Diplomatic management of OPEC. Every administration since Nixon has tried some version of this. Personal relationships with Saudi leaders, arms sales, security guarantees, pressure campaigns. None of it has prevented OPEC from cutting production when its member states' economic interests demanded it. The fundamental misalignment between what oil-producing nations want high prices and what oil nations want low prices cannot be papered over with diplomacy. The honest answer, the one that no politician in either party wants to say, is that the only genuine solution to oil shock vulnerability is to stop being dependent on oil faster than the market, left to its own devices, would accomplish. That requires a scale of public investment and industrial policy that America has never sustained for long enough to matter. And so here we are. We've covered a lot of ground. Let me give you 3 clean things to take away from this. Takeaway 1. Oil shocks are not accidents. They are the predictable consequence of structural dependency. Major oil shock in American history has been preceded by years, sometimes decades, of visible warning signs that were either ignored or actively suppressed. The 1973 shock was predicted by Hubert in 1956. The vulnerability was known. The dependency was a choice made incrementally, through thousands of individual decisions about where to build roads, what cars to manufacture, how to design cities, and the shock was the bill for those choices. The same dynamic is visible today. The warning signs are not hidden. The IEA publishes them. The Federal Reserve discusses them. The intelligence community models them. The question is not whether Americans can see the structural vulnerability. The question is whether the political and economic system is capable of acting on what it can see. History suggests a clear answer. It isn't. Not until it has to. Takeaway 2. The financial markets will see it before the gas pump does. This is the one that most people miss. And it may be the most practically important in a modern, financialized economy. An oil shock doesn't begin with visible shortages. It begins in futures markets, in the gap between current supply and expected future supply, in the risk premiums that traders attach to geopolitical uncertainty, in the spread between Brent and WTI, in the options market's implied volatility for crude, if you know how to read those signals, and you don't need to be a professional trader to track them. See a shock building months before it reaches your gas tank. Watch the OPEC spare capacity reports. Watch Strait of Hormuz shipping data. Watch the U.S. rig count. Watch the SPR inventory. These are all publicly available numbers. They are the early warning system. Takeaway 3. Every previous oil shock reshaped. What came after it? The 1973 shock created the Department of Energy. It created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It created SIFI fuel efficiency standards. It created the political conditions for a massive defense buildup in the Middle East. The 1979 shock helped elect Ronald Reagan and initiated a 30-year era of American energy policy that prioritized production over conservation. The 2008 spike, $147 per barrel, provided the financial justification for the shale revolution. Shocks don't just cause pain, they cause change. The question is, what kind of change they cause, and who bears the cost of getting there? If the next oil shock hits, and the structural conditions suggest it will reshape American energy policy, industrial policy, foreign policy, and consumer behavior in ways that are not yet fully foreseeable. The people who understand what's coming will have time to prepare. The people who assume the current system is stable because it has been stable for a few years will not. Every oil shock in history has been followed by a period when analysts, politicians, and commentators said, "We should have seen that coming." And they were right. They should have the data, was there. The history was there. The structural vulnerabilities were documented, published, and in many cases, officially acknowledged. But the human mind, and especially the institutional mind, has a profound tendency to normalize existing conditions. Whatever price is on the pump today feels like the price. Whatever energy system exists today feels like the system. Stability feels permanent until suddenly it isn't. There is a version of the next 5 years in which the energy transition accelerates fast enough, and shale productivity holds up long enough, and OPEC coordination breaks down at the right moment, and geopolitical tensions de-escalate, and America navigates through this period without a major oil shock. That version exists, but there is another version. The one that looks more like 1973 than the optimistic scenario. The one where 2 or 3 of the structural vulnerabilities, We've discussed converge at the same moment, a conflict near the strait, a severe hurricane season, a debt-driven pullback in shale investment, a coordinated OPEC Plus cut, and the system discovers, once again, exactly how thin its safety margins really are. Which version you believe is more likely says a lot about how you're positioned. Here's the question I'll leave you with, and I genuinely want you to think about it. If an oil shock began tomorrow, not a catastrophic one, just a sustained doubling of fuel prices over 6 months, what in your life would break first? Your commute, your heating bill, your grocery budget, your small business's freight costs, your investment portfolio? Because the answer to that question is not just interesting if this video made you think differently about something. You thought you understood. That's what we're here for. The goal of this channel is never to cause panic. It's to give you the analytical framework to understand what's happening before it's in the headlines so that you're making decisions based on understanding, not reaction.